This summary captures a broad-ranging conversation with Robert Breedlove about money, politics, economics, and human nature. The discussion explores the rise of socialism in modern contexts, the nature of central banking, private property, and incentives, as well as the potential transformative role of Bitcoin. Breedlove delves into historical and philosophical perspectives on governance, coercion, and economic systems while considering future technologies and societal change. Breedlove expresses deep concern over the resurgence of socialist ideologies, particularly in high-profile political scenarios like the election of socialist candidates in major cities. He warns that socialism, with its roots in the abolition of private property, inevitably leads to coercion, shortages, economic inefficiencies, and historically, mass suffering and death. He emphasizes that ideas like "from each according to their ability to each according to their need" have been responsible for enormous atrocities. The failure of socialism stems from its fundamental inability to utilize market incentives and price discovery, which leads to chronic economic dysfunction and ultimately violence as systems collapse under their own contradictions. The conversation moves to the nature of political leadership and nation-states. Breedlove views politicians largely as puppets for deeper, often hidden power structures. Instead of thinking of nations as unified actors, he encourages understanding them as complex amalgamations of rival economic, political, and social gangs vying for control and advantage. Central banks in particular emerge as powerful institutions largely invisible to public scrutiny, but with substantial influence over economies and governance, often eclipsing politicians in power. This deep state, while ill-defined, is considered a key player behind policy outcomes and economic direction. Breedlove traces central banking back to the emergence of gold-backed money systems and the invention of warehouse receipts intended to facilitate portability of gold. The fractional reserve banking system allowed banks to issue more claims to gold than they actually held, generating profit but increasing systemic risk. Governments eventually nationalized or co-opted these banking functions, leading to modern central banks with the power to manipulate money supply and interest rates, what he calls the price of money or time. The central bank's monopoly on issuing currency creates a continual inflationary environment, stealing value from savers and wage earners while enriching asset holders. This institutionalized counterfeiting fuels state power and coercion, undermining free market capitalism. At the core of Breedlove's worldview is the inviolability of private property. He defines private property as the exclusive relationship between an owner and their assets, encompassing the right to trade, exclude, or destroy them. The respect for private property underpins civilization, cooperation, wealth creation, and innovation. By contrast, coercive violation of property through theft, taxation, or inflation is non-productive and destructive. Such violations reduce incentives for productivity by diverting effort toward defensive rather than creative endeavors. This dynamic also explains why socialist systems degenerate. They institutionalize violations of private property and require coercion to sustain themselves, which leads to conflict, violence, and eventually collapse. Money is explored as a tool enabling exchange and transferring purchasing power across space and time. The inflation caused by central banks printing money devalues the currency and redistributes wealth, harming those who hold money and rewarding those who hold assets. Inflation is a euphemism for theft, systematically transferring wealth upward, thereby exacerbating inequality and damaging economic vitality. Breedlove argues that people's failure to understand this theft leads to poor political choices, such as electing socialist politicians promising free stuff, which can only be funded by further inflation and deficit spending. This cycle deepens economic decline and social unrest. Bitcoin is presented as a revolutionary form of money that fixes the fundamental flaws of previous systems. Unlike fiat currencies, Bitcoin has a fixed supply, cannot be printed or inflated, and is fully divisible, portable, durable, and verifiable. It perfects the properties of money lacking in gold and fiat and ensures full private ownership of assets in a digital, borderless form. Bitcoin's blockchain architecture solves problems related to trust and settlement delays inherent in physical gold or paper certificates. Breedlove positions Bitcoin as the ultimate protection for purchasing power and individual sovereignty, capable of defunding centralized coercive systems like central banks and potentially reducing incentives for war and violence. Despite Bitcoin's strengths, Breedlove acknowledges real-world constraints. Most people do not understand or engage with Bitcoin currently, which limits its power as a mass financial tool. Adoption requires education, awareness, and cultural change. There is skepticism about whether the average person cares to preserve purchasing power or run from inflation until personal crises force awareness. Governments, via taxation and violence, can still exert control and confiscate wealth, making Bitcoin not an absolute escape for everyone, especially if individuals are coerced or killed. The path forward involves not just technological innovation, but deep shifts in culture, education, and governance. Breedlove discusses the underlying motivations driving human behavior, emphasizing opportunism over abstract ideas of control. People respond to incentives and will act coercively if it is profitable to do so. This dynamic creates and sustains institutions like central banks and welfare states. The founders of nations like the United States were deeply aware of human tendencies toward tyranny and structured governments to mitigate concentration of power and protect private property. But modern societies increasingly forget these lessons, eroding discipline and personal responsibility, which leads to a ratcheting up of deficits, inflation, and political decay. Looking forward, Breedlove speculates on the potential decline of nation-states as the dominant organizational paradigm, likening Bitcoin's disruptive power to the printing press's challenge to the medieval church. He imagines many city-states or smaller social experiments where different economic models can compete openly rather than being imposed from centralized bureaucracies. This pluralism would allow failed models like socialism to collapse swiftly, replaced by more sustainable and innovative systems. However, this transition may be fraught with conflict, disorientation, and suffering. The conversation touches on the rapid advance of AI and automation and their potential to dramatically increase productivity and reduce labor costs, possibly leading toward a post-scarcity society in certain domains. However, Breedlove is skeptical that scarcity, especially of space and time, can ever be fully eliminated, meaning economics and competition will persist in some form. He worries about the loss of meaning and purpose if humans no longer face challenges or scarcity, speculating that people may seek fulfillment in virtual realities, exploration, or new forms of societal organization. This underscores the complex interaction of technological progress, human psychology, and social systems. Throughout the discussion, Breedlove highlights culture and education as foundational factors shaping society's trajectory. Teaching values such as hard work, discipline, savings, and respect for private property are crucial to avoid decline into socialism and coercion. Without widespread cultural adherence to these principles, structural reforms like Bitcoin adoption or political reform may be insufficient to change outcomes. The conversation stresses the importance of honest dialogue and awareness about the causes of economic and social problems to empower better decision-making at individual and collective levels.